Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed for part 2 of the August Q&A series. Yes, we're back. We're here in Steve's studio. More Q&A questions. Part 1's up on the channel right now if you want the first part of that stuff. Plenty more Zen 5 questions and other stuff coming your way in this episode. But before we do...
Today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Antec and their new Flux Pro full tower case. This new addition to Antec's lineup integrates real timber on the front panel, as well as a textured multi-directional front grille, giving it a unique style while ensuring optimal airflow. As the name suggests, the Flux Pro offers Antec's patented dual lower air intake design and includes support for up to 9 fans, with 6 PWM fans pre-installed featuring a built-in ARGB controller. The Flux Pro also supports real-time CPU and GPU temperature display and a 90-degree I-shift PSU mount to allow for easy cable management. It also supports up to 420mm radiators in the top and front, along with various cooling brackets to facilitate easy installation. The black and white versions are now available for $180 and $185 US respectively, so for more information, please check the links in the video description.
Given that we've already seen the frankly embarrassing performance gains for Zen 5 over Zen 4,
For gaming.
Do you anticipate that the Zen 5 X3D chips will also provide lackluster gains over their Zen 4 based counterparts?
I would expect lackluster gains purely based on nothing else than the evidence we've seen so far with Zen 4 versus Zen 5. However, I am making no claims as to how they will... my expectation, I'm not telling you that will be the case. I'm not like, yep, Zen 5 was a flop for the non-3D, the X3Ds are going to be the same. It's a flop. Forget about them, move on. They could turn up and they could be great. I don't know. But that is not my expectation. It would be amazing if the X3D chips are great. It would call into question a few of AMD's already questionable tactics, I think. But yeah, it's funny talking with AMD about this. I can't say too much and they honestly haven't really told me anything. But they seem optimistic or somewhat confident about how the X3D chips are going to perform. So I don't know what that's based on.
I mean, I've seen some theories as to how the V-Cache X3D parts would be better than Zen 5.
Yes.
They're thinking that if Zen 5 is bottlenecked by the I/O die, as in we're not seeing substantial gains because the latency over the Infinity Fabric isn't amazing. A lot of the time it has to go out to DRAM, which is slow and hasn't been improved with the Zen 5 design. And obviously memory frequencies, again, you said already in our Q&A series that the memory controller is basically the same. So the optimal frequencies are going to be the same between the two parts. But when you add V-Cache in, more of the crucial parts of the game can be put into cache versus DRAM, so you don't have to go out to DRAM as much. And if that is a limiting factor for gaming performance, and if it did have better latency out to DRAM and stuff, we would be seeing more of the Zen 5 architecture being used for gaming. If that is true to some degree, then it's possible, though I don't know how likely, it's theoretically possible that having more of the crucial game elements in cache will allow the Zen 5 core architectural improvements to shine more. So that's possible. I'm not saying that will apply across all games where it's going to happen. But
it's far from a full-blown conclusion as to which way that's going to go. Ultimately, we don't know. There's definitely some logical explanations for why it could be better.
Yeah. But it's a guess. It's a pure guess. And if I was going to... I think my expectation would be very similar to yours. We've seen X3D for 2 generations of CPUs already, so we kind of know roughly what the performance uplifts generally are, comparing the original parts to the X3D parts. They were pretty similar between the 2 generations. So yeah, I would expect the 9700 or 9800 X3D to be slightly faster than a 7800 X3D, but really not anything to get crazy over. But that's just I think it's, if we set our expectations like that, then maybe we won't be as disappointed if it turns out that way. Whereas if we're going, X3D is going to be it's going to be 20% better, it's going to be so good, and then it's like 2% better, it's like, well, that's a letdown, I guess.
mean, if it's a non-event, it's a non-event, really. There's not much you can do about that. Let's just hope it is better than what my expectations are. But yeah, anyway, we'll
Yeah.
test it. We'll let you guys know, and we'll go from there. But yeah, fingers crossed we get something exciting there. Otherwise, it really is all on Arrow Lake to deliver the goods later this year. And yeah, not sure what we're in for there either. All right, Tim, I wish I could say I had a question here that I could answer very quickly for you, but I'm not sure I do. But anyway, the question says, or asks, or, does the question thing. You following?
Yep.
Good. Does it still make sense to keep your DDR4 if you are upgrading to LGA1700? So obviously LGA1700 platform from Intel supports DDR4 and DDR5, though not simultaneously and not on the same motherboard. So you actually have to pick a DDR4 or a DDR5 board. So to answer this question, a whole host of factors. There are a whole host. First of all, how much DDR4 memory do you have? Is it a 16 gigabyte kit? If it's a 16 gigabyte kit, just leave that on the board that you've got, sell it or give it to a friend or do whatever. If you've got 32 gigabytes and it's quite high quality stuff, then yeah, you do have a bit of a dilemma on your hands. And if it's more than that and you need more than that, then yeah, more of a dilemma. If you look at like motherboard pricing, I've made a few notes here. The cheapest B760 board that isn't garbage is about $130 US. And then Z690, and these are DDR4 boards, mind you, they start at $140 US. Z790 start at $150 US. So regardless of whether you're buying DDR4 or DDR5, you're looking at having to spend around $130 to $150 US on your motherboard before you even buy the CPU. And then what's the cheapest LGA1700 CPU that you're bothering with? Like, is it something like a 12600K?
If you're upgrading, yeah, you probably want that.
So that's $185. DDR5 6000 32 gigabyte kits, even the relatively low latency stuff, they're like $85. So the memory is by far the cheapest component of this. That's not guaranteed to deliver more performance. If you're CPU limited in a lot of games and instances, you will see more performance. And I imagine you're upgrading your CPU because you want more CPU performance.
Yep.
So if you're trying to do the upgrade as cost effective as possible and you've got a 32 gigabyte kit or better, then yeah, look, DDR4 can make sense. But if you're going for a Core i7 or better, a reasonable quality motherboard, then $85 or up to $100 for your memory, you might as well just buy a new memory, right?
Yeah, I would have thought so. And also that you have to toss up how many upgrades you're thinking of making in the DDR5 generation, because there's the potential to carry over that memory for a little while. Now, obviously, if you buy DDR5 memory in the future, it's probably going to be cheaper and better. So that's one angle you have to sort of factor in. But obviously, if you make this upgrade now and you go with DDR5 and then you're thinking in a couple of years, you might be able to upgrade to like maybe an Arrow Lake CPU or AM5 switch over to that, then you could make that memory swap over. So there's a bunch of different angles. I would think for most people, you'd probably be wanting the DDR5 upgrade at the moment, unless, as you said, like you've got like 64 gig of DDR4 and you don't want to fork out, nearly $150 to $200 on that for DDR5.
Yeah, if it's sort of your budget entry level stuff, every dollar counts, then $85 US isn't a trivial amount of money. But I think if you're spending $300 on your processor, $200 on your motherboard, then $100 for some good quality DDR5 does become quite trivial, and you would just do that. So,
yep.
Neither of us are wearing It Depends hoodie, but it depends. All right, Tim, quick one here. Will AM5 ever be as good as AM4?
Not looking likely at this stage, is it? No. Obviously, having a generation where you're not seeing performance gains kind of hurts the platform overall, whereas with AM4 we saw pretty consistent gains. And like I talked about, and I think the question will be part one of the Q&A, there was a lot more gains that could be made throughout the early days of Zen. Lots of things that could have been improved and did improve in the AM4 generation. We only got one AM4 generation with X3D. Across AM5, it's likely that all generations there'll be some sort of X3D part. So that's a big chunk of performance that is probably not going to be added on to whatever part comes down the line for this platform. So that immediately makes it pretty difficult. And then you have a generation that doesn't improve performance. It gets harder again to be at that level. So, yeah.
Yep. Yeah. It is too early to call because we don't know what's going to happen with Zen 6 and all that sort of stuff. So, but yeah, seems very unlikely that AM5 is going to be a repeat of AM4, which is very disappointing, but
yeah, I mean, there are ways to salvage it a bit for productivity performance. Maybe not so much gaming, but they've had 16 cores for a while now, so increasing that up to a higher core count could improve some productivity applications. Obviously depends what sort of designs they go for there and memory bandwidth concerns and all that, but that's one option that could be taken. But
yeah, it seems likely that we're not going to see nearly the performance uplift from the beginning to the end of the sockets or the platform's lifetime, and probably not as many genuinely new architectures released either. So a shorter lifespan overall. But that's yet to be seen. That's just what I'm guessing will be the case.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty safe... When you have one generation that doesn't really do that much, I think it's a pretty safe bet that what you're saying is likely.
Yep.
What's your take on AnandTech's finding of significantly increased inter-CCD latencies for the Ryzen 9950X? Yeah, that was an interesting finding from their review of those parts.
Yeah,
sure.
I've got a few notes because I only just recently looked into this. I did hear about it. I think I saw it on Twitter or something like that. They were talking about it. But basically, the guys from AnandTech, they're using an internal tool that they've developed for measuring this, which they have found to be very accurate. But they themselves aren't exactly sure what's going on here. They think the tool's accurate and the information they're getting is accurate, but they're not exactly sure why. And they've publicly said they'll be doing further testing, further investigation to try and work out why they're seeing what they're seeing and if what they're seeing is indeed accurate. But for those of you not up to speed, I'll quickly explain what it is that they're seeing. So this is from the 9950X review. It's the core complex die. There's two of them on the 9950X. So this first part, we're talking about the core-to-core communication within one of the dies. So there's 8 cores in there. And generally speaking, when they communicate with one another, for the 9950X, it's about a 20 nanosecond delay on average. So it's quite quick. They're communicating via the shared L3 cache there. So that's all within the one core complex die. And with the 7950X, it was an 18 nanosecond delay. So there's like 2 nanosecond difference there. You'd hope that sort of stuff would probably improve, but that's not the shocking finding. It's the CCD interconnect latencies that are the real problem here. So for cores of different CCDs, they need to communicate across the Infinity Fabric out to the IO die and then to the other CCD. So there's a bit of traveling that goes on there, which is going to increase core-to-core latency, but it increases it quite badly. So the 7950X, so the previous generation 16-core model, that had a CCD to CCD latency of 76 nanoseconds. So that's a much higher than the 18 you see within a CCD, which is why if you're running a game, for example, you want the game to be running on the 8 cores within a CCD and not going, oh, this core is going to go then out to this core, and that kills your frame rate. So there's all that problem. But with the 9950X, it's now 180 nanoseconds. So we've gone, it's basically a little over double the time delay for core communication between CCDs. AnandTech has speculated this could be a problem with AMD's processor power management, provisioning driver, or perhaps it just is an issue with the Zen 5 architecture. So they're not sure exactly what the problem is there. As for our speculation on what the problem could be, it could be something as simple as a chipset driver that the core is going to sleep, and because it's not an extended workload, it takes maybe 100 nanoseconds to wake the core up and then do the pinging that they're essentially doing. So maybe that's not really representative of real world workloads. Hard
to say.
It's too hard to say. Really, they need to do more testing and dig in and find out A, if the results are accurate, and then B, what is the explanation for them. But we haven't really seen... I haven't dug into this too much and done a whole heap of testing, but generally we've seen gaming performance, which is pretty sensitive to core-to-core latency, but it's more your DRAM latency that really hurts gaming performance. Again, Zen 4, Zen 5, pretty similar. And even with the dual CCD models, I found performance pretty similar. And when the game wasn't scheduling correctly and it was just using cores all over the place, I saw a similar performance hit between Zen 4 and Zen 5 in terms of FPS. Again, I haven't done a whole heap of scientific testing to really confirm that, but based on when I was seeing that, it didn't look alarmingly low or anything crazy like that. So
yeah, you'd expect when the latency is more than doubling from Zen 4 to Zen 5 that it would have a significant impact for gaming in those scenarios.
Yep.
And the fact that you're not seeing that, I mean, I'm not saying that that testing is inaccurate, but it might just be that in certain other workloads, the latency isn't as high, or that isn't a limiting factor for gaming as one angle as well.
Again, I'm not saying it doesn't affect gaming performance either. I'm just saying I did a little bit of testing because there was the whole core parking thing and all that issue before the reviews went live. So I do a fresh install anyway and install the chipset drivers and do all of that. So my data from the get-go was fine. But when AMD sent that email, I'm like, well, I better check all of this because I've found for gaming that the 9950X basically equals the 7950X, which was honestly to be expected based on what we've seen from the from the Ryzen 5 and Ryzen 7 parts. So I checked it all out, and then I deliberately broke performance by just taking an SSD out of an older Zen system and installing the chipset driver, but it's not a fresh install. So and it behaved exactly as I would expect a 7950X to behave. So anyway, I don't really have any additional insights or theories, and I'm not even convinced that this is a huge problem, at least for the testing and stuff that we're interested in. But interesting nonetheless.
Do you think CAM2 memory modules might be eventually repurposed for use in graphics cards to allow VRAM upgrading, or is it simply not possible to reach the VRAM speeds we need in the future with this connector? I'm going to go out and say right now that I think this won't happen, just based on the fact that generally GPU memory needs to be very close to the GPU die because it is run faster than what we see from DDR memory. So putting that into its own chip and needing to place it a little further away and making the design a bit different to accommodate it will probably result in a memory speed and latency reduction. Latency is obviously very important for GPUs as well. So I can't see that happening. It would be nice to get upgradable VRAM, but...
Well, sort of. Really, let's be honest here. You shouldn't need to upgrade the VRAM on your graphics card.
Ideally,
if every generation was paired with the appropriate amount of VRAM...
Yeah, they're not doing that though, are they?
No. But if you bought an RX... I'm not saying Radeon GPU is better or anything, so cool it. But if you bought an RX 6800 or even a 6700 XT, you haven't even thought about VRAM. It's not a thing that it's just it's irrelevant to you. So yeah, if the RTX 4060 Ti 16GB was the $400 card, probably still wouldn't be amazing, but you wouldn't be talking about VRAM there. If the 4070s had more than 12, again, you wouldn't be talking about VRAM there. And if the 4060 had to come with 12, fine. So really, if you get enough VRAM, an appropriate amount of VRAM for the generation, you're not going to really upgrade it. Like if you bought an RX 588 GB, at no point you're ever like, oh, damn, I wish I could upgrade this to 16 GB. By that point, there's no point spending more money on memory to improve it.
Because the GPU is pretty... Like, by the time you need 16 gig on a 580, the 580 is pretty slow.
It's even a similar thing with desktop PCs, right? DDR5, you really buy a 32 gigabyte kit. If you're gaming, for most people, 32 gigabytes is fine. You buy a 32 gigabyte kit. You really don't go to 64 upgrade until you buy a new platform. And like a lot of people on AM4 would have had 16 gigabytes towards the end. That would have started to get a little bit tight for the latest AAA titles, but still would have worked. Especially if you had enough VRAM. And then when you upgrade to AM5 or whatever it may be, that's when you buy your 32 gigabyte kit. So most people buy their 2 memory sticks, they whack it in there from the start, and that sees them out. It's rare that people will go and upgrade their memory. But again, it's nice to have that option there on the desktop. I'm not saying nobody does it. I'm just saying it's more rare than it is sort of a common occurrence. But yeah, with VRAM, I know people are looking for all these. How do we solve this VRAM problem? What are the solutions? It's like, just start with enough VRAM. That's really it. Because you don't need to go adding VRAM to cards that have enough to begin with. Like, I can't think of any past examples. Like, even 1080 Ti Never Die. Do you need to add more VRAM to that thing?
Still going today. Seems to
well,
work just fine for some games.
Doesn't support ray tracing for a start. You can't use DLSS 3 frame generation, both of which use more.
We can't use DLSS on it.
No, so
at all.
No, that well, yeah, more. I meant more though. The DLSS frame generation is what uses the more VRAM.
Sure, yeah.
I think we haven't really observed that as much with FSR frame generation. Doesn't seem to use nearly as much VRAM. Again, I haven't done a deep.
I think it does use more VRAM, but
not
it
as
has
much. Not as much based on the testing that I've seen. Anyway, stuff.
How come the recommended power supplies for video cards, for example, 650 watts for a 6700 XT, are so much larger in capacity than the typical gaming system under load? So yeah, this comes up a bit, I think.
Yeah, I think there's a whole heap of reasons, really, and there's no like one reason or specific example. It's more of a generalized thing. For example, in general, you want to have a bit of headroom so your power supply is not working at 100% capacity. Power supplies are pretty efficient these days, so that's probably less of an issue now. It's probably an older thing that's carried over when power supplies were a bit more trash. You didn't want to run them too much over 50% for prolonged periods of time, or they might go pop. These days, much higher quality components, much better efficiency. But even so, you know, there's a few reasons why you'd want headroom. One, you're not running the power supply at its maximum capacity or its maximum rated capacity for extended periods of time. And also, you know, you might go from a mid-range GPU with a mid-range CPU to a more, you know, high-end CPU with, you know, a higher-end GPU. I've had plenty of friends that have, you know, previous generation they got an RTX 3060, and then this generation they've gone like 4070 Ti to 4080. So having the headroom there with your power supply. So if you had an 850 watt unit, for example, you've still got plenty of headroom there. And the efficiency, let's say, window for these power supplies is quite broad now. You can run them as low as 15% load right up to about 90-something%, and you're still getting really great efficiency. So yeah, it's more just about sort of longevity for the power supply and future upgrade stuff. But also, like, we're not saying get a really big power supply in case you upgrade in the future or whatever, because that's sort of silly as well. But 650 watts for a lot of the quality power supply ranges start at that. Like, you don't see too many 450s anymore. Most power supply series, do start at 650. And then go to 750, it's like $10. And I think 750 to 850 is kind of a sweet spot. You buy a good quality 750 or 850 watt power supply, and you really never need to worry about your power supply again. You keep that bad boy till it blows up, basically.
I think there's a couple of other angles that I'd be thinking of, one of them being transient power spikes. Mm-hmm. So while under load, you would normally see an average of, you know, maybe 300 watts to 400 watts full system, which is obviously well under 650 watts. Mm-hmm. There can be spikes above that, especially if you get a crappier power supply that's rated at 650 watts, for example. It might not be able to handle any transients above that at all, in which case you would see crashing potentially for your system, and you'd want a bit of headroom for that. And secondly, these companies are trying to think of all usage scenarios. So while a typical system is only going to have a CPU, a GPU, maybe a couple of storage devices, especially back in the day when people were using hard drives, they want to make sure that if you've, for some reason, put 20 hard drives into your system, that there's enough headroom with your power supply to run all those hard drives and all your fans and all the other power-sucking things these days, RGB lighting and all that stuff, right? They want to make sure you can run all of that as well as the graphics side with plenty of headroom, accounting for transients, accounting for all of the efficiency stuff that you've been talking about. So that's why there's such a big discrepancy, especially back in the day. I remember there were, you know, power supply calculators, like a really big thing. You'd put in like how many fans you had and how many this and that, how many DVD drives you were using and all those sorts of things, which obviously add power usage to the system. So yeah, that's why we see power ratings as they are today. And also back in the day, the power that used to get through the rails to the GPU often were just a fraction of the overall capacity of the power supply. It's much closer now between like what goes into the 12 volt rail versus the other rails and all that. Whereas back in the day, you used to have like 200 watts of capacity on like the 5 volt rail, which is kind of useless, and not as much on the 12 volt rails and stuff. So that was a whole thing back then too. So maybe it's a bit of legacy stuff from those days.
Yeah. All right, what are your thoughts on games taking up so much drive space today? It's getting ridiculous with some games where we are now at hundreds of gigabytes. Is it because of the amount of high-res textures, lack of compression by developers, or both?
Yeah, I've never been too concerned about the storage space of games. I know like Call of Duty gets a lot of criticism for being 300 or 500 gig or whatever it is these days, which is, I guess at that level it's kind of fair enough. Does that game need to use 500
It's also
gig?
because it just keeps growing. It's like a tree.
Yeah. Like the visual quality of Call of Duty and what the game is actually doing, to me, doesn't really need 500 gig of storage space, but okay. I feel like, though, if we're talking about like the premium visual experience games, so like Black Myth Wukong that we saw, which is, I think it's like 130 gig for that game. Horizon Forbidden West takes up a lot of storage space. Those sorts of games, if you want detailed environments, high quality textures, diverse worlds, large open world maps, and then all the story stuff, usually audio takes up quite a bit of storage space. So all the in-game cutscenes and audio and all that stuff use a fair bit of space. If you want all that stuff in a modern game, yeah, it's going to use some space. And I feel like I'd rather see developers just create as much storage usage as possible if that leads to a great game that runs really well. You know, we don't have compressed audio artifacts. There was that period of time when a lot of games had like pretty low quality audio, which could have been solved by just using more storage space. And like obviously textures we've talked about in this Q&A series, games could just have better textures and use more storage space. And tends to be something that, you know, it isn't, I feel like storage isn't that expensive or prohibitive a lot of the time. Like 2 terabyte SSDs, you can't store tons of games on those, but
It's also the downloading that. But it's like,
yeah,
if you Google this question, for example, you'll see people 5 years ago asking this question, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and the size they're talking about gets smaller and smaller, obviously, the further you go back in time. But it's just the natural progression, right? The games get more detailed, they get more realistic in terms of how they look. They require more storage space. It's kind of like, I always, getting back to the VRAM thing just briefly, I've seen comments, people going, using more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM is absurd. Games should never need to use more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM. It's like, have we drawn this line at 8 gigabytes of VRAM? Like, why wasn't it 1 or 2 or 4?
Yeah.
Like, why have we got to this point where 8 gigabytes, you know, we've been seeing mainstream GPUs using 8 gigabytes of VRAM for so long now, and we don't seem to be able to get over that hurdle. But then people justify it in its bad optimization. Games shouldn't use more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM. I think to myself, what? It's going to be weird looking back in 10 years from now, this whole 8 gigabytes of VRAM thing, sort of a blip in history. But yeah, look, games get bigger and better, which means they get bigger. And hopefully they get better. Like, I know there's the optimization thing, and you talked about this in your Black Myth Wukong thing recently, like, you know, optimization, and, you know, there's a lot of bad examples of it. But games overall, I know this is going to be really controversial at this point in time to say this, are getting technically more impressive and better as we go forward. Like, there are definitely plenty of games you can point to right now that are way better looking and way more technically impressive than games 5 to 10 years ago.
Yeah, I think how often do we see game developers talking about their new game having the 20-30% larger world map? Like, where does all that go? Like, it has to be stored somewhere. I feel like there was a period of time where a lot of games were roughly 50 gigabytes, and I think that was largely due to trying to fit onto discs for consoles, which obviously limited. I think was like a single layer Blu-ray was like 50 gigabytes, and you can get dual layer like 100 gig or whatever the case. I'm not an expert on Blu-rays. Don't even remember.
I don't even remember.
But game developers were having to compress their game to fit on discs, and that was obviously bigger issues the further back you go in gaming.
Which is another example, right? Well, when I started gaming, we had floppy disks.
Yeah. I mean, the days that even like CDs and DVDs, you had to put in like 5 different...
Well, that was the floppy disk
thing. You had the 5-disc version, and you have to put that in.
So bad.
Whereas these days, that limitation, as we move to digital, isn't really a thing anymore. They're not trying to fit it onto a disc. They're just like, well, people are going to download this game largely, even on console. So we'll just fit 50 gigabyte of the game onto the disc and then make you download the extra 70 gig. So that's the way games are made these days. And as we move to digital, there's less requirement for the game to be a certain size. So that's removed some restrictions on developers. And I feel like that is improving games. And as you were talking about going back and looking at games previously, I feel like a lot of people sort of have like nostalgia brain for what games used to look like 10 years ago. Like when I was doing the Intel Arc video where I went and played my entire game library on Arc, and I was playing games like The Witcher 3 as an example. I was like, when The Witcher 3 came out, I thought this was like the best visual experience
we all
I've ever
do
seen.
this though.
It looks great.
Yeah.
Like, I was blown away. And then you go back and you look at that game now and you're like, yeah, this doesn't hold up. Like, games have clearly gotten much more technically advanced. And that happens all the time. People think like, yeah, surely that 50 gigabyte or 20 gigabyte game I played in 2005 was awesome. Maybe 2005 for 50 gig games is a bit outrageous, but you know what I mean.
I know
right?
what you're saying. Yeah.
You go back and you're like, wow, that was really impressive. And then you actually go back and look at the games and you compare the two, and the difference is night and day. Games look far more realistic today. So,
yeah, some people enjoy going back and for that nostalgia hit, but I actually hate it. Yeah, I like to remember games for, the games I play. Oh, it was such an awesome game. I remember that. And, because some recent examples, like I got into PC gaming through the Command & Conquer series we talked about before, and they essentially remastered that recently. So I bought that on Steam and I started playing it and I was so excited and pumped to play it. And I was like, oh, this is pretty bad actually.
Yeah,
and
just so much more advanced gameplay and game mechanics.
Same with right. The original COD series, they were amazing. The amount of hours I pumped into those games playing multiplayer and stuff. And you go back now and it's unplayable. So at least that's, my sort of outlook on that whole nostalgia and going back. For me, it's not worth doing. It's better for remembering how great it was. Because you go back and look at those games now and it's kind of cool to see what it was, but for me, it kind of almost spoils those memories. It's like, oh, that wasn't probably as cool as what I thought it was at the time. But yeah, everyone interprets that in a different way. But for me, it's a bit of a letdown.
Yeah.
All right, with AMD rebadging B650E into X870. I got to say X870 as well, not X670. That's definitely going to happen, by the way, in this segment. So I've got that apology out of the way. Is it safe to say AMD has reached NVIDIA levels of scumminess? Shots fired. Holy moly. With their branding and pricing. Whew.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know what X870 pricing is yet, so can't really comment on that. I hope that, considering the two chipsets are very similar.
Well, they're the same. It's the mandatory USB 4. So does that justify renaming B650E to X870?
No. No, it doesn't. I'm sort of caught here because like B650E is quite an overpowered chipset in its capabilities for the market that it's aiming at. Like, you can really get away with a very good experience on B650E.
Well, B650E is just B650.
That's right. You can get a very good experience on B650.
So all the E does is make it mandatory to have PCIe 5.0 for the primary times 16 slot. Otherwise, it's physically the same hardware.
Yeah.
I mean, the quality of the traces and stuff on the motherboard have to facilitate those speeds, but essentially the same thing. And then the X series from that generation just had two of the chipsets, which gave you more chipset lane. You could hang more stuff off the chipset. So that means X870 still is a single chipset solution, whereas X870E would be two, right?
Yes. Yep.
So it's the same thing with USB 4.
Yeah, it's not a mandatory update. I mean, I think this entire question hinges on the price of the boards.
It does, though. I think it's coming more from the angle of just being misleading. Like, if you go and buy an X870 board, you think you're getting a brand new flagship X870 board, when really all you're doing is you're buying a B650E board with USB 4.
Yeah, I get...
So
yeah, yes. I think adding USB 4 does make it a
technically different team.
Technically better product.
Yep.
So... Like, should that have been B850 or X870? It's kind of like the differences between X670 and B650 even then weren't that large on some boards. They were very similar capabilities for a lot of the parts. Like, obviously the flagship E series X670E boards provide a lot more stuff because they were much more expensive and provide all this stuff, right? But I think it doesn't seem like a very necessary renaming. So I can understand it from both sides, really.
I think the best way to put it is, and I'm just declaring this now, I have the best way of putting this, is that it while the naming's not great and everything, it's not a worse product.
We have to check that though. I think it's probably not.
Well, it's
be
the
worse.
same product with mandatory USB 4.
Mm-hmm.
So from that perspective, it's the same or better.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
Depending on how you view the implementation of USB 4. Now, as you say, the pricing is a big component. They're going to charge a huge premium because it's an X870 board.
If that happens, definitely scummy.
Less than ideal. The scummy aspect for me comes, and let's say the NVIDIA scumminess, because for me I have to give an exact or specific example of where I have no problem calling NVIDIA scummy, and that would be like your GT 1030 product, which got desktop DDR4 memory attached to it for pretty much the same price, and it just annihilated performance of an already underwhelming product. So that's essentially keeping the name the same while giving someone significantly less. So I think for it to be that level of scummy, X870 would have to be worse than B650.
Yes. We would have to check, though, to see what the differences are between X870 and X670, because potentially moving from the two chipsets to one chipset, there will actually be some downgrades with the higher number part, which is something I haven't looked too in-depth into.
There'll
the
be
chipset
less
designs.
chipset. Oh, no. Yeah, did I make a note of that, Tim? That's a good... Yeah, okay, so you are getting one less chipset. So...
Like you're probably getting USB 4 with X870 and not
Gen
with
5, guaranteed
Gen 5 versus optional Gen 5. So there's some areas where it goes up and some areas where it goes down. The biggest issue for me is really the B840 platform.
Yeah.
That looks to
scummy.
be like worse than A620.
Yeah.
And yet it's given a B series name, which is obviously designed to make people pay more for B series branding, because the B series has what I feel is the best market perception among mainstream buyers. Mainstream AMD CPU buyers buy B series boards.
Yep.
So they want the crappiest boards to now be a B series, which is not good. Like, that's not great.
I think, in summary, the concern we've had for a while now is that AMD seems to be getting more anti-consumer with its naming and products. You know, parts like the Ryzen 7 5700 isn't what you would think it should be or would be based on that naming. It's not merely a slightly lower clocked 5700X. It's actually an APU without the APU component, so you get half the L3 cache, all that kind of much worse product for basically the same money. Very bad. It's a consumer trap. You don't want to buy a Ryzen 7 5700. We've seen them do that with quite a few products now. Very misleading, dodgy naming, and AMD seems to be doing more and more of that. So this is another example of that for sure. It's not the most scummy, worst thing in the world, but it's not very consumer friendly either. And really, it's unnecessary. Like, they could have just stuck with they already had a convoluted like chipset series as it was with the 600 series. It was already unnecessarily complicated.
800 series doesn't seem like it needs to exist, in my opinion. They could have just made X670 boards with USB 4.
Which we're already seeing anyway. So...
Yeah. In your recent Zen 5 processor reviews, you mentioned that LTT may have been getting results more in line with AMD's pre-release marketing numbers due to using automated benchmarking tools that you thought were not fully CPU limited. Could you explain in more detail how that would change the results? I would have thought that comparing in CPU limited scenarios as you did would show the strongest gains. Also, if Zen 5 does offer increased performance over Zen 4 in non-CPU bound gaming scenarios, so that would potentially be those built-in benchmarks, automated testing sort of thing, is that worth testing and understanding, since in many scenarios outside of competitive multiplayer, you're typically GPU limited these days?
Yeah, so when the Zen 5 reviews all went out and the data was all over the place, which, that tends to happen at the best of times, but probably more so in this example, people were searching for answers. Why does Hardware Unboxed have 2% on average? Why does Tech Power Up have... we had 3%, Tech Power Up had 2%. And then there were the other examples. I think the outliers really for the higher ones were LTT. They were 13% on average, which is quite a substantial uplift compared to what we saw. I think Tom's Hardware was another one that saw 13%. Outside of those two, I don't know anyone else that showed double-digit gains or, beyond 10%. So a bit weird, and people were... I guess from our point of view, we're not calling out LTT or anything like that. They've done their testing, whatever. But the reason we have to talk about it, or why we are talking about it, is because we release our information, our data, and our numbers, and they line up with Gamers Nexus and Tech Power Up, and the list goes on, Gear Seekers, eTechnics, whatever. But then you get these other results that are much more favorable, and obviously people who want Zen 5 to be successful, or they're just confused and interested in it, they want me to explain, why is your data so bad compared to Linus or LTT? Like, what did they do right, or what did you do wrong? Is there something wrong with your configuration? Or just explain to me why we're seeing this massive discrepancy between these two review outlets. So that sort of forces me to look into it, because the whole time I've been trying to work out, did we get something wrong, as my main concern here, because we want to represent Zen 5 accurately. So started looking into it, for CPU testing, LTT Labs, they use a lot of canned benchmarks. So that's the built-in benchmarks you'll see for games like Benchmark Tools. And they often will also benchmark like cutscenes or replays, which tend to not be that CPU demanding. There's a lot of examples where the built-in benchmarks just aren't CPU demanding at all. Black Myth Wukong is one example. I don't think that game's particularly CPU demanding as it is.
They're designed for GPU benchmarking
primarily,
mostly, because the game developers are assuming most people are going to be GPU limited in their gaming, and so they create test scenes and scenarios in those benchmarks that are for GPU comparisons.
That's generally the case. Like, Ashes of the Benchmark, Ashes of the Singularity, that was quite a CPU-heavy canned benchmark. Mm-hmm. And often for those real-time strategy games, the built-in benchmarks are the way to go, because it's really difficult to play to late game to have a lot of units to then reproduce that for accurate benchmarking. Homeworld 3 is another example. For example, there's the Rift Breaker that has a CPU and a GPU benchmark, so two different ways of tackling it. So anyway, there's all those angles. I wasn't really sure what was going on. Like, how were they getting to 13% and we were at 3%? That's a massive discrepancy. Are we both right? Is it just merely the game's tested? Is it the way they're tested? So I started looking into it, and essentially I just can't reproduce their results, especially in a couple of it. Some of the results I can reproduce, some of them are miles off, and I have no idea how they got those numbers. I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm just saying I don't know how to replicate them. I've even looked at the way they've tested. I can't get anywhere near those numbers. So that might be something that they'll need to look at, re-benchmark and investigate. There's also a couple of oddities, like, for example, LTT only tested 4 games. I would have thought for a major architectural update that's taken 2 years to arrive, relative to the previous architecture, that would warrant more than 4 games to sort of evaluate in a day one review. I would have sort of gone with 12 being more the minimum. You're 10 to 12 or something like that. But for those of you who are interested, I've gone and benchmarked the games that LTT Labs did in a very similar way to them. In fact, I think I benchmarked them all exactly the same way. And there's definitely some similarities. For example, F123, they found that the 9700X was 7% faster than the 7700X. So I got 6%. So there's a 1% discrepancy there. It's the same result. Rocket League, they found 13%. I found 10%. Again, 3% discrepancy there. Doesn't really matter. You ballpark. But then the big one that was a bit bizarre to me, and I haven't been able to find a third-party resource. So either I'm wrong or LTT's wrong, but one of us is wrong and one of us is very wrong. And I don't know which one it is. I'm not claiming I'm right. I'm just saying that I've put a lot of time and effort into trying to validate these results. So Returnal, they found that the Zen 5 part was 21% faster. I found no performance difference. So they were equal, and that's using the built-in benchmark, which is what LTT was using to the best of my knowledge. And I've tried the low preset, the medium preset, the highest preset. I've tried all different kinds of things, and the most I can get is a couple of percent one way or the other. So, Zen 4's a few percent faster or Zen 5's a few percent faster. Using the highest preset, they're both the same. So I don't know how they got 21% there. That would need explaining. Again, perhaps there's something I'm not understanding or doing wrong. Don't know. Warhammer 3, they got 11%. I got 1%. So there's a 10% difference there, quite massive. I found that performance in Warhammer 3 was about the same. It could probably range anywhere from about 1% to 5% in probably either direction, but 11% is getting a bit high. So those 4 games where they got 6%, 13%, 21%, and 11% resulted in a 13% average. Across those same games, I got a 4% average. So that's 1% higher than what we got across our 13-game sample. Doesn't really change much on our end. So yeah, but 4% to 13% is a really big performance discrepancy. So yeah, and I don't know why they only tested 4 games, and then why there's the return outlier, because their automated benchmark has about a dozen games it does test. So that would be a question for LTT why they didn't, because if you're going to run an automated benchmark, just show all 12 games, right? That's what I would have done. So I'm not sure why they handpicked 4 to just present. No idea. I have no insight on that one.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of possibilities. I mean, I think it wasn't helped by AMD not producing detailed performance data, because one of the things that you could potentially see when you're benchmarking games, you see some Zen 5 results that are slower than Zen 4, and you sort of go, well, that's got to be some sort of issue. Like, let's just delete that because that can't be right. And there's certainly been examples where you get weird results and they're just unexplainable. So you're like, look, it's easier just to not include that. We'll go with the games where we're pretty sure it's working properly. And with AMD not providing detailed Zen 5 versus Zen 4 numbers, makes it a lot harder to know whether your testing is right. And that's a big issue that you ran into. So I'm not saying LTT did delete results or do anything like that, but I'm saying my main point is that AMD did not help reviewers figure out whether things are right or wrong. We saw PC World not even publish their review at all because their numbers were low, and they were like, what's going on here? We can't validate this. We're not going to publish our results. And then eventually the other reviews come out and they're like, okay, well, we're probably more in line with being accurate there. So
what I will say is, since those reviews went live, which again doesn't help since it was after the fact, was it about 20 games they compared the 7700X and the 9700X?
Sure.
Was it about
20 games from 5 years ago, or maybe a couple from the last couple of years.
It was about a 20-game sample, though, they benchmarked. And they found, on average, the 9700X was 5% faster. So AMD themselves, with their own internal testing, with a very odd selection of games, for whatever reason that may be, they found a 5% uplift on average. So I think it's safe to say it's up to 5% faster on average, likely a less than that. And I will have a video coming up for you guys in the near future where I'll be testing over 40 games comparing these two CPUs with a few different configurations. So a lot of that data I already have. So I have a very good idea of how these two CPUs really do compare across a wide range of games. And it ain't double digits, I can tell you that much. So I think anyone who's reporting double-digit gains for gaming almost certainly have done something wrong in their testing. But again, I'm not saying LTT are wrong. It'd be great to get some clarification from them on like the returnal result, that one in particular, showing the 9700X beating both the 14900K and 7800X 3D. That's a bit of a, eyebrow raiser, that one. Definitely needs further investigation because that's a substantial performance uplift in it. With a small 4-game sample, an outlier like that just blows your average out of the water. And look, I had ACC. That was an 18% performance uplift for the 9700X. That having tested a lot of games now, I can tell you that was an extreme outlier and the biggest outlier. So I've tested more than 40 games now, and 18% was the biggest outlier, and that just happened to make its way into our day one review because we've tested with ACC for quite a long time now. So that's really why my results were a bit higher than Tech Power Ups overall, because I included ACC, which juiced the margins for Zen 5 a bit there. I thought there might be more outliers like that, which is why I went investigating and looking. I've got a few more games that people have reporting good margins in that I want to look into, but so far, it's looking like for gaming, Zen 4 equals Zen 5, or Zen 5 equals Zen 4, whichever way you want to go about it. Pretty similar overall.
All right, we're going to hit the pause button, not the stop button, the pause button on the questions.
A couple of stretches, I think, in order.
Since you've turned 40, is your whole body, your bones, they're starting to ache.
Got to do my mid-Q&A yoga.
Well, we'll get a mat out. Steve can go do that over there.
Yep.
And I'll stay here and talk about, I don't know, what else do we talk about at the end of these videos? There's Discord. which you get by being a Patreon member.
I think so.
Float Plan member.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about live streams, which we do occasionally. So there's that.
Yep, we'll do one of them in a few
BTS
hours, actually.
videos, yeah. Subscribe to the channel. You called me out the last episode for you're always the person that does the like and subscribe. And
yeah, well, have you done the like thing yet?
I want to be a real YouTuber too, so like and subscribe, please.
Right, that feels right. Feels right, Tim.
Nice. So yeah, thanks for watching to the end of this video. And there'll be more Q&As on the channel in a couple of days, so stay tuned for that. But until then, I'm your host, Tim.
I'm your host, Steve.
See you in the next one.